Okay, we are going to jump into chapter 8. Why do I say jump in all the time? I need to learn some more lingo. We're going to dive in. There you go. We're going to dive in to chapter 8. And I know you probably already sat through like about an hour. So just like in class, I try and be spunky, but there's only so much I can do, especially when we have to get through so much information. But let's move on here. Your learning outcomes are listed here like they are at the beginning of every chapter. We need to be able to understand what an intellectual disability is and maybe some of its causes, describe the specific language and communication characteristics of children with intellectual disabilities, the factors related to language development, and the impact of language on the literacy skills of individuals with intellectual disability, often referred to as ID, and discuss methods for enhancing the language and communication skills of these students. Here's some key terms. We're going to be talking about several different disabilities, especially at the top. I assume most people are fairly familiar with Down syndrome. And then I would say next, some people are familiar with Fragile X. Not many are familiar with Williams, but these are kind of the three main ones that your book focused on and that are probably going to be the most prevalent. And then we'll get into some of these other key terms. So looking at what do we know right now about what the definition is and what the causes of intellectual disabilities. So there's a video here, and it's not going to let me play it for you, but when you pull up the PowerPoint that is in your Blackboard instructional unit for chapter 8, you would be able to watch this video it's just interviewed some people about how they want to be treated even though they have intellectual disabilities. And so it was a good little video, but the definition, what are the two main components of contemporary definitions, meaning so the most recent? The two main components would be the score, so they have to have significant limitations in intellectual functioning. In Missouri, that equals IQ of 70 or below. Some states say 75, where your IQ test has to be 75 or below as part of the criteria, but in Missouri it's actually 70. It's even lower than that. So that means those kids that fall between 70 and 75 that someone consider as intellectually disabled, Missouri does not. It has more stringent guidelines. But here's the other piece. Not only do they have to have that score below 70, they have to have adaptive behavior concerns. So this has happened to me many times and working with kids, and I think it will with you too. What happens is sometimes you have a kid with a low IQ, but they have good adaptive skills or life skills, which is good, right? Because we kind of think of like low IQ, and then some people associate that with like the lowest adaptive skills also, and those would be your kids and life skills that maybe have significant disabilities and cannot toilet themselves, cannot eat by themselves, that just are working on really basic essential skills. And then there's kids that are in CrossCat, or those are kids that might just have learning disabilities. They function pretty well. They're just falling behind in academics, and so they get that pull out and resource time, or maybe they have a para or whatever. Then there's this group in the middle, and it's really hard, but I've seen it many times. There's these kids who might have an IQ in the 50s or 60s, which is low, but their adaptive skills are great. They can, they can function independently. They can eat and drink, and they can go to the bathroom by themselves. Those are the main daily living activities I can think of, but they can kind of look and function like other kids their age, but they're really not mentally. But yet they don't qualify, and so they're in regular education, and they kind of just get stuck, and they get frustrated because the content is too hard, but there's no in the middle for them. They don't qualify for any service. What happens oftentimes is sometimes those kids will qualify for language services, or those kids come up through early childhood. In Missouri, it's called YDD. And so they might have some services through speech, maybe through kindergarten. But then, because they have those adaptive skills, they don't qualify. So it's just a big thing you will see as you get into it, is that it's not just a low IQ and IQ below 70. Their adaptive scores have to be low as well. And if they're not, then they do not qualify in Missouri. What we know about potential causes, there's genetic conditions that cause intellectual disability. That would be something like Down syndrome, where there's an actual chromosomal difference that's genetic. There could be problems during pregnancy. There could be problems at birth or problems after birth. Number 2, problems during pregnancy. Those would be things like kids who suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome. The mother drinks heavily, maternal drug use. You can see sometimes those cause intellectual disability. Problems at birth. So maybe they have a low birth weight, they're premature, they have some kind of traumatic brain injury on their way out into the world. They have a lack of oxygen at some point after they're born, which can and does happen, and so that causes some brain changes sometimes. That would be an example of a problem at birth. And then a problem after birth. So this is, they come and they're healthy, but maybe they have a serious childhood disease. And I'm talking things like meningitis, encephalitis, lead or mercury poisoning. Something pretty drastic has to happen. And that would also include, traumatic brain injury of any form after they're born. And so that could also be a cause of lower intellectual functioning. This is referring to that number 1 back there, genetic syndromes. And this is what I had mentioned. We really focus a lot on Down syndrome, which is trisomy 21, Fragile X, and Williams syndrome. Down syndrome and Fragile X are pretty similar. Oftentimes in research, they're studied together. But I think most people are most familiar with Down syndrome. So these are the main ones that you will probably see in your classroom when it comes to a student that has intellectual disability. It's probably from a genetic syndrome. And we can't have discussion, so I'm going to discuss with you. I'm going to share the answers here. So what are some changes that the book mentions that have occurred in the field of ID? And you can find these answers on page 97. But the big thing is that there's been this big push for inclusion. There's also been some things like Rose's Law, which was a law that meant a lot to a lot of people, that basically said we're not using the word retarded anymore. And that was a huge win for those with intellectual disabilities, because that just really has a negative connotation, even though that's not how it started. If something's retarded, it means it's slowed down. But we no longer use that in their diagnosis. And then another thing that's really changed around 2000, so when George Bush was president, he did this No Child Left Behind thing, which, if you've heard about it, it's not always great things. I think there was good intentions behind it, but one thing it did do is it made entire schools, not just the special ed teacher, really responsible for the education of all students and the success of all students. And so it just brought more accountability there. Whereas once upon a time, there might have been this classroom with kids with disabilities where everyone was kind of like, they do their thing and we do our thing. And I hate to say it because it sounds so cold and judgmental, but if they just weren't as concerned with their success. And so when New Child Left Behind made these mandates that every single student, regardless of a disability or not, has to meet these certain standards, it did bring some accountability that these students would get the highest level, or at least a higher level of service. So it's good. We've seen good changes. And then how can the concept of behavioral phenotypes guide our understanding of intellectual disabilities? We are constantly discovering patterns of characteristics that are related to the underlying genetic disorders. So this is just as they're looking at literally, the DNA, they're trying to figure out what the exact specific cause is, because if there was an effort to change it and prevent it, you have to know what the cause is first. Okay. So what are some language and communication characteristics of these kiddos? So in early language for Down syndrome, they use some nonverbal communication rather, but they don't vocalize a lot at first. They tend to be late talkers, so their first words might occur at age 2 or 3, but they kind of catch up and have multiple word utterances around age 4. Williams syndrome, they do use verbal communication, but they have similar receptive vocabularies as Down syndrome. So they might be delayed in their vocabulary, like what they understand, but they have larger expressive vocabularies, meaning they can tell you more than they can understand, and they can tell you more than a student with Down syndrome. Fragile X, and here it's limited research, but you see delays by 12 months, and there is a growth in their language skills over time, but a gap, you start to notice a gap widening compared to their peers. So even though there's some development, it's so slow that the gap widens really rapidly between what maybe they're doing as a 3-year-old compared to a neurotypical 3-year-old. How does this affect speech production and phonology? So this is more about articulation, understanding them, their intelligibility. A really common characteristic in individuals with Down syndrome is they can be really hard to understand. But if you understand kind of why, from their physical standpoint, from the biological standpoint of how they're made, they have lots of anatomical differences. They have a difference in their vocal tract, their vocal cords, their facial musculature. They might have impaired hearing, and just motor functioning in general might be slower. And then the tongue, that's a really big one. If you've worked with individuals with Down syndrome, you almost always see that in resting position. So if they're not talking, their tongue is hanging out of their mouth, it's protruding from their mouth. And that's because they have really low tongue tone. It's not a very strong muscle for them. And so by that same reasoning, they don't articulate as clearly. And there's only so much speech therapy that you can do to change that. I mean, it's a genetic condition. So it's going to happen. It's almost always going to happen that those kids are harder to understand. And they can receive services, but there's also a lot of compensatory strategies you teach them about how to get their message across. This is another reason, because it's hard for them to communicate. So they have a language, perhaps, like they know what they want to say, but you keep having to ask them, what did you say? Because you can't understand them. That's where some behaviors come in. And kids with Down syndrome are often associated with difficult behaviors. And this is one of the reasons they're behaving, is because they get really frustrated when you can't understand them, just like anybody would. And so it's all connected. But you will often see your students with Down syndrome qualify and receive articulation services and language services, trying to make them as intelligible as possible. Then we look at Williams syndrome. There's similar speech production as typically developing children, so they don't have those issues. And Fragile X, they don't tend to have those issues early on, but sometimes you see these delays worsen the older they get. And so that's a hard diagnosis because it's kind of progressive. It doesn't necessarily get better.